Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we have a special guest joining us in the studio, Muhammad Faisal Aziz. He is the president of the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia, or Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia, better known as ABIM. Welcome to the show, Faisal. It's good to have you here.
Nice to meet you.
Now, I understand that ABIM just celebrated its 49th anniversary very recently. I'm wondering, because I didn't realize that this organization had been around for so long, and I was wondering whether you could very quickly walk us through some of the evolution of ABIM, maybe some of the main highlights in the past 5 decades.
All right. First of all, thank you, Melisa and Sharaad, for having me on behalf of ABIM. First of all, in charting the way forward for ABIM in conjunction with our 50 years anniversary next year, of course, a review must be made critically, especially in terms of historical background of the Islamic movements around the world, particularly about the Muslim Brotherhood, where most of the Islamic movements around the world predominantly subscribe the idea of Muslim Brotherhood. So, in conjunction to that, of course, we are from the new generation of political Islam, so-called, or the Islamists. We need to critically analyze what was in the past, perhaps by reading all the materials, literatures from outside, even Exposito, for example, Fawaz, about the failure of political Islam in the past. So now heading towards 50 years ahead, for example, for ABIM, of course, there are a lot of rooms of improvement that need to be done, especially in terms of highlighting the flaws in terms of activism, for instance, in Islamic movements, and how do we perceive Islam as a solution. So basically, 2 or 3 things that we can highlight in the past. We perceive Islam as a solution. It is not just about the theory or any speech that sounds rhetorical, but how do we perceive Islam as a solution? So in 70s, we established, for example, Islamic cooperative to give fund for the young parents who want to establish their career, for example. And also we also established our schools as a complementary to the national schools. And now we are also having a refugee school for Rohingya and Syria. And in 1990s, we established Hospital Al-Islam. So basically, these are all the things that we want to highlight. Islam is not just about rhetoric or theoretically speaking, but it is more than that. How do you find a solution to serve the community? How do you find a solution to foster the relationship among the community?
Right, that's fascinating because many people say, well, okay, education, a school is a school. You know, a hospital, especially a hospital, might be a hospital without necessarily having Islamic characteristics, and that would be very interesting to see how you apply Islamic principles to something as modern and secular as a hospital. But before we get into that, I really want to ask you about your idea, and you started us with the idea of Islamic movements globally, right? And ABIM starting in the 70s, we have I don't know, the kind of standard flag bearers of the Islamic movement in this country. We think of Anwar Ibrahim, we think of PAS, so on and so forth. What is it that was happening in the 70s that ABIM was responding to, that ABIM was formed in order to be a response to? We come out of 69 and so on and so forth. What was it that ABIM was responding to?
Okay, ABIM, we highlighted a book written by Anwar Ibrahim then, Islam as Solution for the Plural Society. It was in responding to the May 13 issue, where all in all, it is all about how do you be inclusive in building up the society. Because if I may revert back to the issue of Islamic movement around the world, according to many kind of literatures, saying that they have 2 basic problems which they fail to move on. First, about the concept of power-centric concept, being too much exclusive. For them, all this kind of political Islam is just about to rule this country. And secondly, perhaps they are focusing more on imposition of the Sharia without looking into the context, the right framework. So ABIM, we are in the clear path, moderate way. We perceive all this kind of ideology as something that will not bind us, but it is just a persuasive kind of thing that we can learn, we can take into consideration. So, and in fact, having 49th anniversary, we from the young generation of ABIM, we of course, obviously, after reading all this kind of, perhaps the failure, we need to depart from this kind of old cycle, because we can't afford to repeat the failure of the political Islam.
Faisal, can I ask you, I mean, you were trying to explain ABIM's core values, right, the principles that it stands by. But what is, after almost 5 decades, what do you think is the public's perception of ABIM?
I cannot answer absolutely true, but from what we heard, actually it is now, for me, myself, my emphasis more on engagement. We engage to all across the board, across the political divide, even the CSO. Even for us, it is about how to share the limited resources.
Okay, so when you do these public engagements, what do you hear from them when you say, "Hi, I'm Faisal from ABIM"? What is it that how do they respond to you? Do they think that you're coming from a conservative religious point of view? Are you trying to convert them? Are you trying to engage? What are the responses?
Yeah, actually, there are multiple responses, because ABIM, we have undergone many kind of scenario of Malaysian political Islam, which was highlighted during 80s, 70s. Even in fact, when Anwar Ibrahim was in the government, ABIM was accused of being highlighting the process of Islamization. But if you know the historical behind that, it was not the Islamization process of Islam, but it was part of to balance up between the extreme, because previously we have Arkam, even we have the so-called extreme certain political parties that highlighted the racial or religious sentiment. So we try to use the channel of the government in a middle path way, highlighting Islam as a solution on the middle ground. But of course, in terms of perception, as I said, there are multiple perceptions, because some people perceive ABIM as politics, as political activists. Some perceive ABIM as social activists. Some perceive ABIM as perhaps religious authority whatsoever. So I'm open to that, but all what we need to do is to give explanation about the evolution of ABIM itself.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but let's come back and continue this conversation with Faisal in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan, and we're chatting tonight to Muhammad Faisal Abdul Aziz. He's the president of ABIM, that is Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia, or in English, the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia. Sharaad, you had a question for Faisal?
I have so many questions for you, Faisal. It's fascinating because you talk and you begin with this whole question of the failure. You mentioned the theorist and actually observer of Islamic politics, John Esposito, in your first remarks. But 1779, the Iranian Revolution has an incredible influence around the world in terms of Islamic, and the notion of what an Islamic political society might look like. Okay. And I don't know what the assessment in ABIM is of Iran, because today Iran still remains an Islamic republic. Does that influence, the Iranian Revolution still reverberate today? And is it seen as a failure?
For me, the major ideologies that influenced ABIM was, of course, during 1970s or 1960s, established by, as I said, the Hassan al-Banna, even the reformists like Abdo and so on. And
this is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Okay.
And referring back to your question on Iran, there is no huge impact on ABIM or even on the Islamic movement on how to revert back. But in fact, if I may share as well, Iranian Revolution give a huge impact to Islamic Party of Malaysia past when they, after all, they established the Council of Ulama, the Clerics Council, as symbolic to Wilayatul Faqih, meaning to say the Clerics Council decided everything under the Iranian politics.
So it was modeled on that Iranian
Yes.
Idea of leadership by the clerics.
Yes.
Okay.
But as far as this issue is concerned, it doesn't concern ABIM at all, because Iranian Revolution, we perceive it as a revolution. And of course, about the voice of people, aspiration of the people, and of course there were certain things that violated the rule of law, or the laws, the peaceful condition of Iran, that we are not condone to that.
Okay, so Iran and the revolution is a long, long time ago, almost 40 years ago. We had with Turkey and the experience of Erdogan and the PKP, the Welfare Party, another moment that was global for the Islamic movement. What about Turkey and its example of Islamic leadership in modern politics?
Yes, initially, Turkey or Erdogan played a very significant role in bringing the new phase of Islamic movement, because if you read through the history, Erdogan also was part of the kind of Islamic party, Refah, where the ideology derived from Islamic movement as well. But at least Erdogan, he perceived the failure of the past, and he know how to counter the failure and how to react professionally, especially when he himself trying to establish the principles of welfare of the society rather than Sharia imposition or Islamic State theory, or Islamic State in terms of being exclusive more on Islamists per se. So Erdogan played a very major role in terms of giving a new breath, for the Islamic movement across the world.
Well, you said that a little bit earlier. You said that there were flaws in the Islamic activism movement here in Malaysia, right? And part of this new generation of ABIM after your 49th and 50th anniversary next year, you wanted to change that.
Yes.
You wanted to kind of come to terms with the mistakes of the past.
Yes.
I want to ask you about Islamic activism leadership here in Malaysia. What is that landscape like? How does ABIM work with others in its similar field?
Okay, as I said, the failure was contributed by the ideologies of being exclusive, perhaps the term holy than thou and so on. But for us, it is now a new generation of Islamic movement, the new generation of political Islam. We need to be more inclusive in terms of sharing resources with the rest of the world. We need to be more open-minded, and we have to bear in mind that this country is a country that we share together. It is not about predominantly dominated by the so-called one type of Islamic group or Islamic segment or whatsoever. It is all about how do you share prosperity together, how do you serve the community with the spirit of togetherness under the name of Malaysia.
But aren't there limits on pluralism? I mean, every community and ideology has limits on pluralism, even those that embrace it, right? And I'm wondering about groups like ISMA. ISMA's come out to take a very strong, almost exclusivist Islamic Malay perspective on where this country ought to go. Yeah. Where does ABIN lie in terms of the spectrum of ISMA, Ikram, Pesan Pengguna Islam Malaysia, and all those different groups who have articulated a view of the country?
We depart from that, especially from ISMA or even the PPIM, because we have our own goal. For us, in upholding the principle of Islam, you need to understand that at the end of the day, you need to have the right goal. For me, the problem is because the contestation of idea, a certain group of people, they thought that the ultimate goal is just to establish Islamic State, just to impose the Sharia. But for me, it is not just that. Imposition of Sharia and establishment of Islamic State is one of the way to reach another goal, that is like prosperity, stability, peaceful condition, justice, and so on. So if you have the right framework within the right context, so you ought to know that what the direction that you have to do.
But isn't ABIM, sorry to interject,
Yeah.
but isn't ABIM under tremendous pressure by groups like Hizbut Tahrir? I mean, they are in Malaysia, they criticize mainstream organizations like yourself, you know, for being, you know, too interested in seminars and, you know, and so on and so forth. I mean, how do you respond to these radical critiques of moderate Islamic groups?
Yeah, we used to have a debate, but after all, we agree to disagree on the point table by both of us. But at the end of the day, we proceed with what we are. I mean, our self-conviction, deep conviction about Islam as a way of solution, Islam as a way of life, need to be portrayed as something that can produce justice, fundamental rights, stability.
For all?
Yes, for all.
Okay, all right, we're going to take another quick break and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me is Sharaad Kuttan, and we're speaking to Muhammad Faisal Aziz, the President of the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia, or ABIM, Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia, which just celebrated their 49th anniversary last week on the 6th of August. Faisal, just you know, before the break, you mentioned that you wanted to, you know, have a more inclusive approach. Yeah. The new leadership, the ABIM going forward wants to have this more inclusive approach. And I wanted to ask you about engaging those who hold different views to ABIM on either side. So how do you do that? How are you engaging those who hold different views from what ABIM says it espouses?
Basically, we do some engagement with certain projects. For example, school intervention program. ABIM together with certain organizations like Dongzong, even Tamil Foundation, we establish a concrete to foster relationship between ABIM schools and also Chinese and even Indian, Tamil school. So that's mainly by projects. We also do some engagement based on the issues. For example, on the issues of refugees. Now we are living in this kind of xenophobic rhetoric. Of course, we can't afford to work in silo. So we do engagement with human rights group, human rights defenders, even with the, even the non-Muslim activists who fighting for the refugees, and basically moving long forward, we also do some engagement in terms of how do we share the data, how do we share, certain resources that we can get benefit together to build this country together.
And it's very interesting because we're living at a time where the country is very divided politically, and we had that power shift in 2018, and then we've had this reversal this year. You know, in terms of a message that you give to your, you say you're not a political organization, and you kind of straddle both, I think, in many ways, right? So tell us, what is it that you want your constituents, your members to be focused on in times of political crisis as we are going through now?
For us now, all of us have known that we are in the process of toxic political scenario, which leads to political fatigue, not only among ABIM members, but also among the whole society. And for us, it is now for ABIM to emerge, to produce the new leaders. For us, now, Malaysian, we are no longer in need of politicians, but we need leaders. It is all about leadership. Who are those leaders? Leaders who can produce alternative to this kind of toxic political scenario. Structural reform, for example, to put an end to this political turmoil, for instance. So we do need leaders. So in terms of ABIM movement, what we are trying to do is to serve the community, to provide alternative, even though we are not politically oriented, but at least we need to give more enlightenment to the people, to voice out, to have better alternative in the future, especially when it comes to decision-making process.
You know, youth is central to your name, right? Central to the cause.
Yes.
Kata belia, right?
yes.
So, and there's been a lot of talk about the voices of youth not being heard today. That it is dominated, the political scene is dominated by boomers,
Yes.
and forgetting the issues that youth are actually facing in today's world.
Yeah.
How is ABIM looking to amplify the voices that are not being heard of young Malaysians?
Yeah, for me, of course, we need to produce more young leaders, young leaders in politics as well. But at the end of the day, what kind of young leaders that we need? You yourself, as young leaders, you have to prove that you depart from the old cycle.
Right.
That you will not replicate the same political
So
behavior.
not just young leaders, but old ways,
Yes.
right? New ways, yes,
Yes.
young ways.
And I do believe, I'm very optimistic, if you as young leaders, if you can show to the public the alternative, the practical solution, that you definitely will depart from the old cycle, the so-called political animal behavior or whatsoever by George Orwell. I'm very optimistic people are with you.
Why? What is your optimism? What is the source of your optimism, Faisal? Is it a personal one? Is it because the organization is built on this idea that people can change? Where does this optimism come from? People are very pessimistic, by the way.
But people want solution, that's it. I'm very optimistic. People want solution. People no longer want those who are riding on the racial sentiments, like what we said just now, xenophobic rhetoric or religious sentiments. But we want what solution that can you put on the table. So if you manage to highlight, to outline the solution way forward, as I said, even though there are certain pessimistic argument about that, I'm really optimistic because at the end of the day, I trust the wisdom of the people.
That's a fascinating
Yeah.
one. Very quickly, what is the hardest sell for you? What is the argument that's most difficult for you to make to your audience in convincing them about pluralism, about solidarity across ethnic and religious?
Inclusion,
What is the hardest argument to make?
Yeah, the hardest argument, for instance, when we had Bangsa Malaysia conference, of course, it is not hardest for us to explain among ABIM members, but among the general public, due to these sentiments of right-wing populism, not only in Malaysia, but of course across the world, in India, in UK, even in US. This kind of the hardest thing that we need to explain. We need to give explanation. So, for instance, when we talk about the Article 153, the affirmative action, we must note that affirmative action is something that empowering one race. But it doesn't mean that you are disempowering other races. So in this case, you have to make it clear that Article 153, in implementing the Article 153 or affirmative action, the principles of equity applies. So equity in terms of growth, economic growth. Otherwise, it will create another injustice, for instance. So this kind of things, you need to give more explanation. And that's why sometimes ABIM sounds esoteric, because we quite philosophical in terms of giving explanation. If I may share as well, like what was written by Syed Hussein Alatas in his book, The Myth of Lazy Native. It is very important, though it sounds esoteric, but The Myth of Lazy Native was written by Syed Hussein Alatas to counter or to debunk the propaganda propagated by colonial, saying that the native in Malaya, Indonesia, Philippines are lazy, they are not assertive, they are dependent too much on colonial in bringing development and so on. And unfortunately, this kind of ideology being embedded by UMNO during 1970s, where through a book released, the name of Revolusi Mental, and it was critically criticized by Syed Atas. So, in order to justify the affirmative action, which creates another culture of patronage, which create another the feudalistic approach in terms of ruling this country, it is something cannot be tolerated because it will create another injustice, as I say, and it will undermine the Malays itself. So this kind of the things that we need to give more explanation to the Malay. Yes, of course, the poor Malay need to be helped, but it is not to the extent that you are downgrading yourself.
Right. Faisal, we could continue talking to you for a lot longer, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have on this episode of Considers. Thank you so much for being on the show, and congratulations to ABIM on its 49th anniversary.
Thank you.
I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.